Hello, thank you for clicking on the video. My name's Steve and this is Everyman Fragrances. Now, this is a video I've been wanting to do for an absolute age, and for whatever reason I just kind of never got around to doing it, but I'm finally doing it today. I want to compare Hafez 1984 to Mancera's Red Tobacco. Now, I've been wanting to do this ever since I appeared on the Cologne podcast and I shared my first kind of smelling of Red Tobacco, because it's a fragrance that Ryan absolutely loves and gets loads of compliments on. I smelt it and I didn't enjoy the opening, but then as it dried down I started noticing the comparability to Hafez 1984, which I think is a better fragrance, and I told Ryan he needs to try it. So I'm going to try and break down my little comparison. I've got my original bottle of Hafez 1984. You probably can't even see the label because of the lighting. And I've got a sample of Mancera's Red Tobacco from Fragrances UK, Fragrance Samples UK. I've gone through practically all of this. There's a tiny little bit left. I've gone through several wearings of this actually. Sometimes just on its own, or sometimes just as a comparison, wearing each on my arm. So I'm going to break down the differences, and I'm going to do it in kind of sections because as they dry down and develop, they do change in my opinion. So let's start with the opening. So what do they smell like when you first apply them to skin? Now, obviously, if you're going too early, you will kind of get some alcohol, and sometimes, you know, you've got to let a fragrance settle before you sort of fully appreciate it. So when I'm talking here, I'm talking basically within the first 10 sort of 15 minutes, that sort of touch. So not literally spraying it straight away, but basically in that first kind of opening. Mancera's Red Tobacco is not good in the opening, let's be honest. I think we can all agree on that. It definitely takes some time to kind of get to an enjoyable stage, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So both of these fragrances, in my opinion, have got a medicinal kind of vibe in the opening, but Hafez 1984 is noticeably sweeter. The sort of sweet, spicy fruit come through more, and definitely the addition of that sort of booziness from the rum is noticeable straight from the off as well. But it's quite intense as well. Both of them are quite sort of strong, but Hafez is definitely stronger in the opening. I think from that booze, it's just kind of come through and sort of really hits you. And as I say, probably the sweetness as well. It just is a bit stronger and a bit more depth in the opening, but still has a sort of slightly medicinal vibe. Mancera's Red Tobacco in the opening, as I say, is not particularly enjoyable. It's more noticeable. It's not quite as sweet. You do, I mean, in both fragrances you get some of the sort of tobacco vibe. I think the tobacco comes a bit earlier in Mancera's Red Tobacco than it does Hafez 1984. But Mancera's Red Tobacco is definitely not as sweet in the opening. I get a hint of a kind of cherry accord in the opening, but it's sort of more medicinal than Hafez 1984, and it's a lot drier on my skin. I don't know if it's my skin or Mancera, but I've tried a couple of their fragrances and it's the same with Cedric Brase. It just comes across as really fucking dry on my skin, that Cedric Brase, and this is a bit the same, particularly in the opening. Before any of the sort of real sweetness comes through, you get a hint of sort of cherry, or I do, but it's just really dry to the point where it kind of feels like it sort of starts choking the back of my throat, like it gets in my throat. It's like, it's that dry, I find. So yeah, the opening, I'd say Hafez 1984 is potentially a bit too strong, a bit intense from that booze, but it's still much nicer in the opening than Red Tobacco. So moving on to more the dry down now, the notes I made at the time when I was kind of doing some of these comparisons were after about sort of 45 minutes. So between 30 and 45 minutes, I considered that to be sort of dried down. Did go then to a next stage where it's fully dried down after a couple of hours. But yeah, so after you've got through that initial kind of opening phase and then you've gone into sort of 30 to 45 minute kind of dry down type phase, Hafez 1984 definitely loses its medicinal kind of, any sort of medicinal vibe it had in the opening, and also it loses some of that boozy edge. I think the opening is quite strong and intense from that kind of boozy rum, and that is still sort of there, but it sort of dies down a little bit. And Hafez 1984 dries down to a really lovely fragrance. I'm a bit biased because I do love this fragrance, as you guys know, but it basically, yeah, it's not, loses the medicinal vibe. It not dry on my skin at all. It's just a really nice balance between the sort of spicy, sort of sweet fruit and the tobacco. They just blend down together really nicely on the dry down, and it loses any sort of medicinal vibe it had in the opening, and it loses some of the intense booziness from the rum, but that does sort of remain a little bit in the background. But yeah, you're just left with a very well balanced, slightly kind of sweet, spicy tobacco, which is kind of lovely. It's a gorgeous scent. I think this fragrance, I've worn this as my sort of Christmas Day fragrance before. I think that sort of vibe, it's very comforting, very warming and pleasant to wear. I think if you went to like a Christmas market or like a fair in the evening where it's sort of quite cold or something like that, this is just perfect. It's just warming, pleasant, easy to wear, just really well blended. I mean, you can hear I'm a bit biased because I do love this fragrance. As for red tobacco, after that sort of initial opening phase, once it starts drying down between sort of 30-45 minutes, it does improve a lot. Red tobacco, I think, just gets better the longer it's on your skin, to be perfectly honest. The opening is just not good, in my opinion. It's just not that nice. After that sort of 45 minutes, it dries down and it blends. The notes sort of blend and the accords blend together, and it balances out a lot nicely. It still remains a touch medicinal to me, but it loses a lot of that. So it loses a lot of the medicinal vibe. It loses a lot of the dryness that you get in the opening. I think it's still drier than Hafez 1984, and it's still slightly more medicinal. But it just loses a lot of that because it just blends together a lot more nicely, and it's just much more pleasant to wear. It gets the cherry sort of note that I get, or the cherry accord that I get in the opening, is still there subtly, but I think the vanilla in Mancera Red Tobacco starts to come through a little bit to add some sort of subtle sweetness, as opposed to the spicy fruit that you get in Hafez 1984. I think it's the vanilla that comes through. There's still a subtle kind of cherry type accord, but that, in my opinion, the sweetness in Mancera's Red Tobacco isn't sweet enough. It's very subtle, but for that reason, I think it does make Mancera's Red Tobacco more masculine than Hafez 1984. Hafez 1984 is perfectly unisex. I think Mancera's Red Tobacco probably is unisex as well, but that one leans a little bit more masculine because the dry down is still, it's not as dry as the opening, but still drier than Hafez 1984. It's probably a little bit sweeter than the opening, but still not as sweet as Hafez 1984. But it's more kind of woody, like the woody oud kind of that comes through, and it is more of a woody oud, not a barnyardy oud. It's very much like a kind of woody base kind of comes through with the tobacco. And then there's a subtle kind of vanilla fruit sweetness that comes through. So yeah, Hafez 1984 is a sweet tobacco from spicy fruits with a touch of booze, where Mancera's Red Tobacco is a woody tobacco fragrance with a subtle kind of vanilla / fruit sweetness that comes through, and not really any booze. So that's the kind of difference in the dry down. Hafez 1984 is definitely sweeter. Mancera's Red Tobacco is probably more masculine and definitely more kind of woody. I think they're both good fragrances in the dry down. I really enjoy them more. I probably just prefer Hafez 1984, but I can see why people appreciate, people like Ryan appreciate and enjoy Mancera's Red Tobacco in the dry down, because it definitely improves. But they are different. That's it. Those are the differences in my opinion. They both have medicinal openings. Hafez 1984 is sweeter though and a bit more boozy, where Mancera is certainly a lot drier and possibly even more medicinal. But then as they dry down, they're both really pleasant fragrances, where Hafez 1984 is more of a kind of spicy, sort of sweet fruit with a tobacco vibe, where Mancera's Red Tobacco is more of a kind of woody, oudy, but a woody oud, tobacco kind of fragrance with a subtle kind of vanilla / cherry sweetness to it, but both super pleasant. I would say Hafez 1984 is definitely the better performer though. It sort of projects more, and it's I'd say they probably last the same amount of time actually. Mancera's got quite good longevity, but it's just not as noticeable. It doesn't project as much. So yeah, Hafez 1984 just beats it on performance purely on the sort of projection of the fragrance, even over time. So that's it, that's the video. I hope you got something out of it. Do comment below and let me know what you, kind of which of these two fragrances you prefer, what you think are the main differences. Do you prefer one and your wife prefers the other, or you know, vice versa? Do let me know and comment. I do really appreciate all your kind of input and insight, because it helps the kind of community and other people, because as I always say, I'm just one man with one opinion, and that opinion is worthless. Thanks again for watching. Do really appreciate it. Like, comment, subscribe and all that shit, you know the score, and I will see you for a video soon. Take care, much love.